Well, thank you very much for y'all to come on by for this last individual presentation. We will be having a panel discussion immediately following. In light of the previous presentations that we have, I want to advertise once again to mention we will be having a session tomorrow at 1 o'clock. We want to address what we can do about making a difference in our economy at the local level. We want to question how can we create, once again, a viable, prosperous, sustainable local economy to give our local citizens good-paying jobs, to be able to produce consumable goods, and a local market. So we're going to be focusing on that theme tomorrow, kind of as a follow-up, playing off of what a lot of the presentations have said already. So at 1 o'clock, we'll have a presentation with Dale Allred of Jacobs Cove Heritage Farm, just across the street. And then we'll also have one of y'all's peers, Zach Whitmore, is going to be talking about his activism. So presentation at 1, and then there'll be time to discuss at 2 o'clock in this very room. So thank you for those of you that have been around the entire day. Those of you that are just coming in, we've missed some interesting and really powerful comments along the way on how our economy is working, what is the potential flaws with how it's organized and structured, and what we want to do coming up in our panel discussion is ask the question about where do we go from here, and what kind of consensus can we come to among the various perspectives that are all different in many ways, yet we want to find some common themes. So I want to introduce now Korkut Erturk, professor of economics up at the University of Utah, the only professional economist on our panel, and I have to say he is an example already, has illustrated just what a compassionate, kind-hearted man he is to sit there and take all the grief that has been flung towards economists in general. I'm really, I'm sorry for that in a way, but I do think you are the ideal person to withstand and to rise above and to represent that discipline in a really powerful and strong manner. So thank you for your patience. And the idea is to have a professional economist, one who has been thoroughly trained in the theoretical canon, in the methodological issues. Korkut is Professor Erturk, perhaps maybe more appropriate, is a recognized expert, not just in the United States, but widely abroad, as understanding the nature of our economy and what the flaws are that have led to the instability of recent years. And I've asked him to play the role of doing a bit of a review, highlighting some of these issues and themes, and also perhaps adding a little bit of information as to what the economic discipline may see as things that are lacking in our discussion thus far. So that's a very tall order. It's a Herculean task, to be honest, but I'm very confident that if anybody could do such things, it would be possible with this presentation. So we'll see as it goes along. I hope it didn't build things up, but thank you very much, and please welcome Professor Korkut Erturk.
I very much appreciate talking to non-economists. And let me begin by saying that economists deserve all the grief they get. Let me also add that there are many of us within the profession who are also very critical with the rest of us, if that offers any solace. Okay, for whatever it's worth. Now, as Jeff said when we got together in preparation of this a few weeks ago, he asked me to listen to everyone and try to put it in some kind of perspective and see if there are any common themes. Now, the first thing to be said about the crisis and the economic difficulties we're experiencing, not only in the United States but globally, is that it's a systemic crisis. I mean, that's a word that gets thrown out a lot. What that means is that layers and layers of determination are catching up with us. with something as complex as an economic system, you always have layers and layers of causes of malfunction. So there isn't just one reason. There are just deeper and deeper and deeper reasons. So it's like an onion, right? There's always another layer. So the challenge is really try to put different layers of determination, if you like, different causes that belong with those different layers in some kind of meaningful context. And the reason this is a systemic crisis is that many of these deeper issues are making themselves felt. Under normal circumstances, in a regular recession, those kinds of deeper issues need not be even mentioned, right? Because they're so deep down, they have nothing to do with the more immediate triggers of the recession. And they don't even rise in people's consciousness. And they don't get any attention. Now, for those of you who were not here in the morning, let me just briefly tell you what I heard as an economist, and then I'm going to tell you how I'm going to organize my time. Now, the first talk today by Paul Maddock made the basic point that this is a crisis of profitability. What is unique about capitalism is that it's a system driven by profits. So the best way to understand what is happening today is to see it from that angle, as a crisis of profitability. Brian Check went to a deeper layer. He basically said that, look, profit maximization and human welfare are two separate things. There's a conflict that we've just ignored. The mainstream economists have ignored. Okay? For the economist, what that means is externalities in public goods, or the problems of externalities in public goods. I'm assuming not many of you had any economics, so I'm going to be as basic as I possibly can be. But if it looks like I'm not making sense, please stop me. Okay? Randy Cook raised an issue that economists thought they settled for good 100 years ago. What is that? The problem of invariant measure of value. Not many economists would even listen to what he has to say. I'm not saying that critically. It has to do with everything about this crisis being a systemic crisis, that questions that we thought were settled 100 years ago are making a reappearance. So let me start with the problem of invariant measure of value. Then I'm going to talk about profitability crisis, what an economist understands or should understand from profitability crisis, and then move on to the problem of externalities in public goods. How the issue gets treated in your textbook, run-of-the-mill economics textbook, and how we can go beyond and relate this story to evolution, historical evolution of institutions. Now that's a tall order. Then comes, if we have time, my bit. My bit is that the common theme in all of these issues is the problem of collective agency. Ultimately, that's the problem we're facing. Now, what the hell that means, hopefully I'll come to elucidate. Okay, invariant measure of value. Now, as Randy said, at one point in time, a corner bushel was 80 cents, and then a month hence, it would be 16 cents. What is it? It's got to have some, what he said, parity. real value that was invariant to changes. So we have to be able to have some reliable measure of wealth. That was the problem that preoccupied political economists throughout the 19th century. Initially, there were people who thought that you could measure wealth by precious metals. The more gold you had, the more silver you had, the wealthier you were. But then, well, Spain had a lot of gold, but it didn't do them any good. So pretty soon it became obvious that these precious metals were simply claims against wealth, not wealth themselves. Right? So what was the source of wealth? What could be an invariant measure of value? Because as it happened, the great inflation of Spain, with all this New World gold flowing in, it simply led to price inflation. So that enhanced accumulated gold simply by the same quantity of goods. The gold became devalued. So it became obvious that you could not measure wealth by precious metals. So what was it? Then we had the rise of what is called in textbooks the physiocrats. And maybe Randy is a neo-physiocrat. Physiocrats argued that the real source of wealth is the land, the primordial loan from God. Right? Then came the classical school in economics with Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Karl Marx too. They argued that it wasn't really the land, but it was productive labor. It was productive labor that was ultimately the source of all wealth. Right? Now, I don't want to get into all that debate because there's a lot of other ground to cover. The crucial point I want to make is that this search for an objective source of value fell off the radar after Karl Marx. We had a major transformation within the economics literature, and the value came to be defined subjectively. Now, what the hell does that mean? In other words, value came to be defined by whatever the market bore, supply and demand. Now, you're going to say, didn't Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Karl Marx know about supply and demand? I mean, it seems really basic stuff. They did. And they thought all those economists who were trying to explain prices by means of supply and demand were silly. Marx used the term vulgar economists. David Ricardo was more polite, but equally dismissive. Why? Their argument was very straightforward. They said, look, supply and demand simply explains why price would deviate from its normal price. If supply is too much, market price is going to fall. If demand is too much, market price is going to rise. But the minute supply and demand are equal, supply and demand ceases to explain anything because it cannot explain why it's equal at that price. So the question is, in order to have a theory, you have to explain why demand and supply come to equality at that particular level and not anything other than that, right? In economics, we had what is called a marginalist revolution, which basically set the stage, laid the foundations of the textbook economics that you've studied. Any economics students? No economics students? Okay. Well, okay, maybe. Okay. So according to this new tradition, what is behind supply and demand is balance of utility and disutility. What does that mean? Well, utility is straightforward. It's subjective satisfaction. You eat one apple, it gives you utility. The second apple doesn't give you as much utility. The third apple still gives you utility, but even less. This is called diminishing marginal utility. That's what's behind the demand schedule, they argued. What about the supply schedule? Well, behind the supply schedule, we have now, they argued, rising marginal disutility. Now that's a mouthful. What the hell does that mean? Think about supply of labor. The more the wage, the higher the amount of labor you would like to supply. Now what that means is that as you supply more labor, the disutility of work increases. Something like this. You work the first hour, it's not pleasant, but it's okay. The second hour, getting a little restless. The third hour is positively boring. Your marginal disutility is going up. So the fourth hour, you're getting suicidal. The sixth hour, you're homicidal, okay? That's why you need to be bribed more, paid a higher wage to work more. So what is equilibrium price? The equilibrium price is the point at which disutility is balanced with utility. So that's what you have behind supply and demand, and that's your price theory. Okay? This is what the economists have established at the turn of the previous century. And ever since, it's stuck. So economists have given up on the question of finding an objective source of value ever since. If it's 13 cents this week, well, that's because tastes and preferences have changed. It's because technology has changed, and that's the right price. Just as 80 cents was the right price 2 weeks before. Okay? Now, this is indicative of the fact that it is a market society. It's a market economy. You all, I'm sure, have heard the term invisible hand, right? We don't have some central agency that basically tells what people are going to do, telling people what the right price is going to be, and so forth. As we say in textbooks, everyone simply follows price signals, right? And that leads to a system of self-organization. Now in Marx, you also have, just like in Adam Smith, a notion of self-regulation, if you like, invisible hand. There's a slight difference. Marx is more specific. He said, look, it's the profit drive, not anything that Adam Smith would have disagreed about. Right? So the central observation is that what makes the system tick is profits and profit accumulation. Okay? Now, before I get into more detail about what a crisis of profitability means, and that might be a little bit technical, and I might shorten that piece as we move along. Let me just briefly give you a sense about where this is headed in connection with Brian Check's talk. Just as this revolution was taking place within professional economics in terms of what value is and price is, the other thing they assumed was that whatever was profitable was also socially useful. Okay? That's a big leap for any average person. But when you take economics, when you're schooled in economics, that's what we drill in you as professional economists. And in fact, the issue never comes up. If an endeavor is profitable, that means that it's socially useful. Okay? That's the assumption. Many of the efficiency properties that economists love to talk about with respect to the market is based on that very assumption. Profit maximization increases or maximizes social welfare at the same time. There are two exceptions which textbooks acknowledge. One is externalities, and the other one is public goods. If you're an economist who gets bothered with all kinds of systemic issues, this and that, and you just want to keep those exceptions to a minimum. If you're an economist who wants to talk to others, you think about externalities and public goods a lot. And that's what I want to do next. But first, I want to talk about crisis of profitability as with respect to what is going on today. And please stop me if this is a bit technical. Okay, let's just give it a try and okay. First things first. Rate of profit. What are these? Okay, just give me a chance. P for total profits. K for total capital stock. So the profit rate is how much profits you make with what you've put in. Okay? That's it. That's the profit rate. The rest is college algebra. Dividing both sides by Y sub C. What is Y sub C? It's capacity output. What the economy with its given factories and resources capable of producing. Okay? So then this flips high school algebra. Taken high school algebra? No. Okay. Then, okay, so this is what the rate of profit is equal to now. Two terms. One term is the ratio of profits with respect to capacity output. In other words, this is an index of distribution, right? What part of the economic pie goes to profits? Call it profit share. The second part is the productivity of capital. How much capacity output the capital produces. Okay? It's determined by technology, which economists love to take as a given. Okay, another manipulation. Let's divide this by Y, actual output. Okay? Then I get another ratio. Y over YC. This is called the capacity utilization rate. In other words, if actual output was equal to capacity output, it would be equal to unity, right? Which would mean that all capacity in the economy would be being used. So if it's less than 1, so we have under capacity utilization. What the economy actually produces is less than its capacity output. Okay? So what do? We divided the profits rate into 3 determinants. Capacity utilization rate, profit share, and productivity of capital. Okay? Now, these are, if you like, 3 separate determinants of profitability. Now, in terms of time scale, the one on the farthest right is the slowest moving variable. And it's not much amenable to policy intervention. The one in the middle is medium term, and the one on the left is short term. You've all heard about Keynesian policies involving stimulating demand. Much of everything is happening with respect to economic policy today. The target is creating aggregate demand so that capacity utilization rate would go up. Okay? This is the general picture that I'm going to talk about, and I know it's a little bit involved, but this is, if you like, the X-ray of the problem at this level of crisis of profitability. Aggregate demand has 4 components. Private investment, consumption, net exports, which is the difference between exports and imports, and government expenditures. Okay? Consumption and investment, they're interrelated. The more investment, actually that feeds back to consumption. More consumption, that feeds back to investment. But investment is also positively related by the profit share and profitability of capital. Okay? Some of the issues Paul Maddock raised involve long-term problems coming from productivity of capital. Okay? This was an issue the last examined by Marx, and among more contemporary economists, it was Schumpeter who picked him up. And we don't have many economists who are doing active research on this except for students of Schumpeter. It's a valid, serious research project. And in fact, it is possible that the Asian crisis was behind the Asian crisis. It was one of the deep-seated problems, that the notion of saving glut, has anyone heard that term? Bernanke's savings glut? Okay. U.S. has been consuming more than it produces. Do we know that? It has a big trade deficit. The question is why? There are two explanations. One explanation Bernanke, the current Federal Reserve Chairman, gave was that there was so much savings in the world flowing into the United States because of its deep financial markets. That led to falling interest rates, rising asset prices, so that all of us as consumers became artificially rich. So we could consume more and more, and that led to imports without any increasing exports. Okay? Now, there was something to that savings glut thesis, except it had nothing to do with the saving side. It had to do with the collapse of investment. But that's too technical an issue. Okay, let me highlight this part, and this is where we're having difficulty with respect to international economics. Much of this investment from the United States has been taking place in the rest of the world. We all know that? In the 1950s, the saying was, whatever is good for the GM is good for the country. Why? Well, because when GM's profits went up, it meant that employment went up in the United States. Now, GM's profits rise, employment falls in the United States. Why? Because much of GM's investment has been taking place overseas. Okay? Half of, roughly speaking, all corporate investment is now outside the United States. Fact. But this is how it's supposed to feed back in our globalized economy. So the income goes up in the rest of the world. That leads to higher consumption, and it comes back to us, supposed to come back to us, in the form of demand for US products, and that should create employment that way. Instead, what has been happening more has been this link. As income has been rising, that meant Chinese were using their savings to buy US treasuries, so those funds came to, this is Bernanke's glut now, savings glut. So those funds came to US financial markets, and all of us could now borrow so much more easily. And what did that do? Raised our consumption. The trouble is, in the longer run, it created a huge indebtedness. Okay? I'm sure you know someone who had problems with credit cards. Right? But there was one thing that led this borrowing-based consumption boom last longer than it would have otherwise in other parts of the world. We could, in the United States, because of the same process, same reason, use our houses as ATM machines. What do I mean by that? So people would build up debt, $80,000 of credit card debt, but they'd have their houses. So the flood of funds meant that prices of assets, like houses and also financial assets, kept rising. So as the consumer, you did not feel overburdened because the value of house was going way up. So he had all this equity, right? So all that credit card debt was in fact justified. Why is it justified? Because the value of your house, your asset, was going up too. So what could you do? You could refinance your house, cash out that equity, pay off those credit cards, and restart the cycle. Right? Does that sound familiar? No? Good. Okay. Now we have a debt overhang. Okay? This is the X-ray of the problem we're facing. Now let me tell something about financial markets at the most abstract level, how one should think about whether financial markets are always bad or always good. I mean, the issues of managed currency were raised. I'm not going to go there because that's all sorts of other issues. But how should we think about financial markets? What do they do? Well, let's start with you and I. When you want to borrow funds from a bank, what do you need to do? Collateral, right? When you go to the bank to ask for a loan, the first thing they ask of you is collateral, right? Is that right? Right. Now, what financial markets do is that they enable businesses to borrow against their future expected profits. Okay? In other words, if you and I go to the bank and say, look, I don't have anything to, show you as collateral, but I have such great prospects. I have these great, brilliant ideas, and I'll be making so much money in 20 years, and you'll be so happy that you then won't go anywhere, right? They need something tangible. Well, that's what financial markets do. They produce something tangible for borrowers to take with them to banks. What's that tangible thing? In financial markets, you can sell claims against future profits. That's what financial markets are good for. So as a business, you basically say, look, here's a nice looking piece of paper. Nowadays it's all electronized. But nonetheless, the story is nicer if it's a gilded paper, right? A bond. What is a bond? It's a claim against a pie in the sky, right? That's what it is. It is profits to be earned in the future, right? Are people crazy? Why did they pay good money for this? Well, that's what financial markets do. Credibility of a company selling that bond is assessed by financial markets. Okay? This is, if you like, a tremendous leverage. It creates the secret of capitalist accumulation when it's running away the way the train does on the cover of Brian Zeck's book. Except it has to be handled very carefully. Why? Because you have to have the right balance between rising profits and rising indebtedness. If profits are rising at least as fast as indebtedness, the story that I told you about how financial markets does not pose a problem. Because you make those profits, create income, you pay back the debts. But once, this is where the crisis of profitability enters into the picture, once the profits begin to rise more slowly and the debt starts to rise more rapidly, it's a very unstable situation for the following reason. The values of those financial assets, the borrowers used as collateral, are simply based on optimistic expectations. Okay? So the minute people start feeling less confident because they start observing that profits are not robust, what does that do? That leads to a re-evaluation of the value of those financial assets. See? Before the financial meltdown and after the financial meltdown, the productive capacity of the United States did not change, did it? We have the same number of factories, we have the same number of skilled workers, we have the same number of this, that, and the other. So what changed? One day we woke up, read the Wall Street Journal, and then we're depressed for 2 months. What happened? Financial markets' assessment of future profitability changed. Okay? So financial markets became more pessimistic about the business machine's ability to generate profits in the future. So that means that the value of the bonds that those guys had sold, which is collateral throughout the financial system, is now devalued. Okay? Once the value of financial assets and wealth begins to decay like this, you're in deep trouble. Okay? And that's why people in the United States globally are trying desperately to keep these asset prices from falling further. Because once you get caught up in falling asset prices, there are not any easy solutions. Just like it was a great ride when asset prices were rising, it looked like forces of gravity did not matter. Now we're in the exact opposite situation. No matter what we do is going to create all kinds of other problems. It's a catch-22. And this is, if you like, how the profitability crisis lies behind the financial crisis. Okay? Let me stop at that. And maybe we can come back in QA. And move on to the other issue. And hopefully we'll be able to connect everything back together. Remember, the economists, the professional economists, at the turn of the previous century, did two things. They got rid of the search for objective sources of value. Right? They said, well, equilibrium price is simply what the market bears, because behind that we have utility, disutility, and that's the end of it. And secondly, if something is profitable, it also by definition means it's socially useful. Two exceptions: externalities and public goods. Now, the textbook definition of externalities is the following. Has anyone heard the term? Okay. I'll take my time. A classic example of externality is pollution. Right? In other words, there's a private market exchange between two willing agents. They're both happy. The farmer buys the chemical produced by that particular company, right? So they're both happy. But the company dumps some pollutants on the river that it's situated next to. Okay? Now that affects the quality of life for the whole community. Right? The river is getting polluted. But because the river has no private ownership, the market system is incapable of having the affected parties, in this case the public, be compensated. Right? So the market exchange creates an externality. There's a spillover effect. Right? No one thought of the community being affected by the pollution. And the market exchange has no way of compensating the community for the pollution. Okay? That's an externality. So in the textbook case, that would be called an instance of market failure, because we cannot rely on the market whenever we have spillover effects. If you had some private ownership of the river, right, the owner would raise hell, go to court, and demand compensation. So because it's not privately owned, we have a problem. The second source of what the textbooks call market failure is public goods. The classic example is that of lighthouse in the ocean. The basic argument says that if you wait for the market to produce that lighthouse, it would never get produced. The reason it would not get produced is because businesses would not be able to make a buck, profit, from producing it. Why? Well, because there would be no way of excluding people who don't want to pay for its services from its services. Right? Think about it. In the dead of the night, 30 miles away, some ship uses its services. How are you going to catch up with that ship and make them pay for your lighthouse's services? Doesn't work, right? This is called excludability. So by definition, then, public goods cannot be excluded. It's called non-exclusiveness. Okay? So here we are. So one definition of public goods is that people cannot be excluded for lack of payment for its services. Okay? The second definition is what we call whether it's rivalrous or not. A private good is rivalrous. Think of an apple. If I eat the apple, David cannot eat it, nor any of you else, anyone else, okay? It's gone. But if I'm using the services of the lighthouse in the dead of the night, it doesn't affect the ability of other ships in the vicinity from using those services as well. It's non-rivalrous. The fact that I'm benefiting from it has no bearing on others, right? So the two definitions of a public good is that they have to be non-rivalrous, and the non-exclusion principle should apply. Let me give you an example to make this really obvious. Think of cable TV or TV broadcasting. According to what I've said, TV broadcasting is a public good. Is that true? Why would it be a public good? Well, you're on your living room, right? Can the broadcaster, these companies that broadcast TV programs, charge you by the amount of hours you watch TV in your privacy? It's like, do they come and install a camera watching you, how much TV you watch, and every month you get billed according to how much, right? See, so it's clearly, you can't exclude people, right? It's also non-rivalrous. The fact that I watch a TV program, depending how big the room is, doesn't make it impossible for others to enjoy it and watch it, right? So it's really a public good. So why are private businesses are in it? Well, they can't exclude. How can they exclude someone who's watching TV? Because they can't demand payment for the amount of TV they watch.
How can they use it?
Yeah. Do they? They can't.
Sure.
Well, there's one way, but I'll get to that. But under normal circumstances, right, they can't tell you if you watch more than an hour, you have to pay extra or you have to pay this amount, right? That's because the real market exchange is advertisement. That's where they make their money. So TV broadcasting is actually, from the point of view we know the Economist, is an externality. Okay? It's the side unintended effect. They couldn't care less unless they have to show these businesses they want to advertise with them that public are watching their programs. Okay? So one way of turning what is intrinsically a public good into a private good involves cable TV. Because now if it's a cable TV and you don't pay, what happens? They cut the cable. But think about this. From an engineering point of view or human welfare point of view, the objective is to dissemination of media from a centralized location to a geographically scattered units, right? That's the objective. So the engineer would be appalled that we actually solve this problem by laying physical cable around the whole continent when we have so many superior technologies to use. Think about it. They literally lay physical cable all around the continental United States. It's the most inefficient, from an engineering point of view, of accomplishing the objective of sharing whatever media that needs to be shared via geographically scattered units. Right? Any engineers? Okay. Why did they do it? Because that's how they turn what is intrinsically a public good into a private good. Okay? Now, this is just to give you an idea about what a public good is and what a private good is. Let me now relate the story to the evolution of history, the historical evolution of institutions, so that we can address the deeper point of the dichotomy between profit maximization and maximization of human welfare, which was behind back of Marx's mind too. Now, think of a primitive tribe. Everything is a public good. Coconut trees are plenty, so when you're hungry, you just climb up a tree, get a coconut. The game is very plenty, right? So it's public good. You share what you produce. There's no scarcity, really. Now, some technological improvement takes place. Someone invents the bow and arrow or some other implement that makes members of the tribe so much more efficient in hunting and gathering. What will that do? Well, that will lead to resource depletion. Right? Because everyone is going to be so much more effective in collecting the low-lying fruit. And then they will be really particular about these other tribes coming to their own side of the river and collecting their fruits. Right? That's the beginning, if you like, of the first relations of exclusion. You're excluding others. There's us, and there's them. That takes us in the direction of what we call common pool resources. What are common pool resources? Now, commodities are rivalrous, okay, but there's no exclusion. Right. In the case of common pool resources, prior to capitalism and rise of market economies, different communities around the world have found ways of managing them in a very sustainable way. And some of the ecologically conscious social scientists are actually impressed by what these people have traditionally done in the past. But these systems of sustaining common pool resources requires that there are well-defined boundaries. Because when you get rid of these boundaries, you run into what is called the problem of tragedy of the commons. Now that's something that professional economists, again, love to talk about. And it's a reflection of the fact that with the rise of capitalism, rise of market economies, many of the systems that could maintain resources in a sustainable way collapsed. Have you heard Tragedy of the Commons? Yes. Okay, what does it say? It basically says that if a particular resource is owned by everyone, it's going to be overused. Why? Because the benefit is private, the cost is social. So not only there is no incentive for self-restraint, the incentive is actually to overuse the resource. Why? Well, it's because of what we call the collective action problem. Think about it this way. There's a nice park, right? You want people not to run it to the ground, whatever that means, A, B, C, D, in that particular context. And you're very conscious about it. But whether it's rational for you to do self-restrain or not, in doing all those things that you think people should not do, depends on what you think the next person is going to do. Right? Think of a meadow. You have these animals that you husband, right? And in this village, you know that if everyone increases their herd by 10%, that meadow will not be able to sustain it. It's going to collapse. Right? But it would be good for you if no one else increased their number of their animals and you did it alone. Right? Then you benefit at everyone else's back. Right? So what's the right thing to do? Well, the virtuous thing to do is self-restraint, not bring those 10 additional cows into the meadow. But what if you assume that regardless of what you do, everyone else will be bringing more cows into the meadow, and meadow is going to will be run to the ground anyway? Then what should you do? Well, then the rational thing is self-restraint is useless. Right? So you should, while it lasts, take advantage of that common resource too. Right? Are you the only stupid guy around? Right? See what happens? That's the tragedy of the commons. Rational, selfish behavior, in this instance, causes the common resource to get destroyed. Right? You see, prior to the rise of capitalism, the market society, all cultures, when you go to Buddhists, Muslims, this, that, and the other, the single most important thing that they feared was free riders, greedy, selfish behavior. So they had developed all kinds of sanctions against greedy, selfish behavior. With capitalism, something amazing happened. With capitalism, we've learned, I'm putting this in quotation marks, to harness selfishness. Okay? Capitalism involves an economic system where you harness self-interest. And the big claim is that that leads to a social good. And that's the basic argument behind Adam Smith's invisible hand. Okay? That's the beginning of the tragedy of the commons. Then we cannot really have common pool resources, because if everyone is acting on the basis of self-interest, then those resources will be destroyed. So what's the textbook economics remedy for this problem? You assign property rights. In other words, if those commons were privately owned, the problem would not exist. Right? If we somehow chopped up that meadow that was publicly owned in the village square and made it the private property of different people in that village, then those resources would be saved, right? That was another thing that the economists took for granted. Now look what happened with capitalism. We started going, by assigning property rights, we start going into these private goods box. Now we turn common pool resources into private goods. We make them rivalrous and exclusionary, even when they're not so, right? For instance, when the World Bank would go to these developing countries, and this is a very much current issue, one of the advice that they'll give places like Cambodia, Thailand, what have you, is exactly this. They have to define property rights so that they don't suffer from tragedy of the commons. In Eastern Europe, right, during this, after the fall of the wall, all industry was publicly owned. So the economists going from the United States and the West, what was the advice they gave them? You have to have a speedy process through which property rights are assigned. Right? In places like Russia, that led to plunder. Right? So basically, you had a bunch of what is called oligarchs owning huge segments of national wealth. Right? Now, the conceptual issue that to an economist like me, Brian Check raises is the balance between private goods and club goods. What we're learning in this crisis, or the environmental problems, is that this box cannot really exist without this box. Now, what is this box? That's the box of club goods. What the club goods does is that it excludes people who are not part of the club. But if you're part of the club, then consumption becomes non-rivalrous. In a way, the rise of this box, market economy and capitalism, had to go hand in hand with the creation of the nation state, which really created a set of club goods. So we don't think about this. Unless you come from other parts of the world and travel and so forth, we take these club goods as citizens of a particular country for granted. Right? But the very fact that you are born into, raised in a national state, means that you benefit from a whole bunch of club goods. Let me try to give you a sense of what this is. Think about 19th century capitalism versus 20th century of capitalism. In the 19th century capitalism, I'm sure you've seen those movies, read these books. You had tremendous income inequality, class differences, huge poverty, right? These gray towns, industrial towns in England, life expectancy of 35, 40 years for industrial workers, right? You know all about it. Human welfare, if you like, was being externalized. You see, prior to capitalism, you did not have modern poverty, in the sense that there was no such thing as individualized poverty, because it was a paternalistic system. Right? The standard of living was really low. Everyone was poor with modern standards, but it would be unthinkable to let individual members of the community fall drastically below of the socially accepted standard for that particular community. Even today, when you go to many parts of the world that are very poor, you won't see individualized poverty the way you will see in the advanced countries. Right? So what was happening? In a way, one of the secrets of capitalism in creating all that economic growth and vibrancy was its ability to externalize human welfare. Because there was no feedback from poor health, low life expectancy to the economic machine. Same thing with pollution. You could dump anything you liked. You could cause any kind of environmental damage you possibly could. That was fine, because the level of technology and the capacity to cause harm was minimal. There was no feedback. You didn't have to clean up. You could just move to the next valley. Right? So what changes with 20th century capitalism is that the things that were externalized, environment, human, I like to call it physical well-being and human well-being, or if you like, physical landscape and the human landscape. Rise of capitalism, rise of technology meant that over time a feedback effect began to emerge. Let me talk about education first. In the 19th century, the thought of public education, generalized public education, would have been considered ludicrous. Any education was for the wealthy. If you were from a family of industrial workers, miners, and so forth, the thought that you would go to school didn't make any sense. During the First World War, the upper class in Britain were shocked of poor health the foot soldiers were. It was an eye-opener. And that was the beginning of the discussions of socialized medicine in Britain. Because now they could see a feedback, right? The thing that they've externalized, the well-being of the lower class, came back to affect them. They couldn't raise their armies properly. They couldn't get their men to fight whoever they were fighting. With the early 20th century, the average industrial worker, because of technological changes and improvements, had to be literate. Now you see the emergence of the feedback effect. How was the system to deal with the cost of educating a whole class of manual workers? It's a huge cost. Now here we have the collective action problem of, if you like, the capitalists. From the point of view of each individual business or capitalist, you want the workers, the pool of workers, to be literate. Except you don't want to pay for it. Right? This is called the free rider problem. So one of the things that the economic historians talk about in connection with the U.S. history, in the economic history in the 20th century, is that the universalization of high school education in the United States was the first in the world, gave the United States a huge competitive advantage in the world economy. Right? It was the first country that really organized public education at a level that they did. And the whole capitalist system benefited from it. But think about it. That's an example of club goods. Okay? The existence of those club goods made the private goods all the more efficient and effective. Right? Okay? So conceptually, the problem that we're facing with globalization is that our ability to rationally provision these club goods have eroded. Okay? And that's what I call the real problem of collective agency. This is not because this administration is short-sighted, or that particular country doesn't know what it's doing. It's a structural problem. It's a structural problem because, just like in the tragedy of the common situation, we have a collective action problem. Let me give you an example of what has happened to fish stock in the oceans. In the case of the fish stock, just like an example of tragedy at the commons, there has to be self-restraint. If you overfish, what happens? you destroy your source of income. Because if everyone overfishes, pretty soon there won't be any fish left to fish. Now, as long as we have well-defined clubs, you can make it rational for people, individual agents, capitalists, what have you, decision makers, to self-restrain. It makes sense to self-restrain if you think the next guy is going to self-restrain too. And if he doesn't self-restrain, there will be some kind of a sanction. Right? You have to be able to take that for granted. If you can't take that for granted, then rationally, it makes no sense to try to self-restrain yourself. Okay? I mean, you would satisfy yourself morally by refraining from overfishing, but if you know that everyone else is overfishing, you might have just as well overfished too until those fishing stocks collapse, which they will collapse anyway. Right? Now, internationally, this is one of the biggest problems. We've destroyed 90% of the fish stock. Because internationally, we cannot, because we don't have a world government, right? United Nations has one meeting after another and so forth, we cannot really sanction overfishing. So technology has improved to such a degree. In the case of whaling especially, this is a very serious problem, right? You have the exact tragedy of the commons type of situation. The incentive is to overfish. Right? What do? This is the generalized problem with respect to environment. This is the generalized problem with respect to ecology. From an economist, at least. What does it come back to? What is the common problem? In order to discuss the common problem, that is the common theme in everything I've said. And how much time do I have?
7 minutes.
7 minutes. Okay. The whole thing comes back to, let's start with Adam Smith's invisible hand. I'm assuming that that's something that you've heard of. Adam Smith has this passage, he says, this came up with you, I think. Who do you owe your dinner? What do you owe your dinner? Is it the benevolence of the grocer and the butcher? He says, no. It's their self-love, right? So the price system is such that the grocer and the butcher are trying to sell you what is profitable for them so that when you go to the supermarket, there are things that you can buy that are affordable, right? So that's the whole notion of invisible hand. What I said that the secret of capitalism at some level was the harnessing of self-interest. Everyone acts on their self-interest, and we have a socially optimal outcome, right? Magic. Now, Adam Smith was aware of an important qualification to this argument. He realized that people had to act on their enlightened self-interest as opposed to short-run opportunistic self-interest. For instance, they should clearly not engage in fraud, force, or theft, or what we would today call cheating, or the general term used for this kind of thing is opportunistic behavior, right? Suppose you know you can get away with cheating, misleading and manipulating. Well, the invisible hand argument says that's the best you can do for the society, right? So Adam Smith said, look, in a liberal society, you can't rely on the threat of punishment to keep people from acting opportunistically or unlawfully. Otherwise, it has to be a police state. So the secret of this invisible hand I'm talking about, he said, is really works when people act on their enlightened self-interest, which is what? Knowing that it's best for them to play by the rules of the game and not cheat even when they think it's reasonable to think they can get away with. Right? That's what enlightened self-interest is. But in the case of enlightened self-interest, what's the decisive issue? Is it awareness or is it structure? For an economist, it's not just awareness. It's the structure of interaction. What do I mean by that? Suppose everyone is aware of the fact that acting on one's enlightened self-interest is the right thing to do. Does it make sense to act on your enlightened self-interest? Well, it depends on what you realistically expect other people will do. Let me give you an example. Think of a tourist destination, okay? So these tourists are coming off the plane, and there are these cab drivers. The tourists don't know the language, they don't know the location, so they're easy pickings. Right? So the cab drivers can charge them 5 times, 10 times the normal right price. Suppose you're one of those cab drivers. Should you cheat? Well, if everyone cheats in the sense that overcharges these gullible pure tourists, there will be a backlash. Right? Sooner or later, that destination will acquire a bad reputation. Authorities will step in. So there will be some kind of a negative reaction at the end that's going to harm all of us. So what's the right thing to do in terms of your long-term enlightened interest? Well, you can kind of chip them off a little, but don't overdo it, for God's sakes. You should just charge them the normal price. That's in your long-term interest. Would you do it? What does it depend upon? Well, economists, we like to see how you do this and what happens to our interest. The calculus is that it pays to self-restrain if other people also self-restrain. Okay? That's the punchline. So if you think the next person is not going to restrain, then your self-restraint is not going to pay off. That's the central issue. That's the central issue with Wall Street too. When these derivatives and financial innovations were taking place, when individual firms were taking extra risk, the market was rewarding them. The companies that stayed away from synthetic, what are now called toxic assets, lost market share. Okay? So what was the calculus in the context of the process that led to the crisis? Yes, everyone knew in the Wall Street that there was going to be a judgment day. It couldn't go on the way it was going. But self-restraint did not pay. Okay? On the contrary, some of the institutions like JP Morgan that stayed away from mortgage-based assets came with a gusto a few years after everyone else took over the market because they were losing stock value and running into serious problems, even though they were the first who came with the idea in the late 1990s. Okay? What is this? This is the failure of the system to act in its collective interests. Okay? The thing that's common with the ecology and the financial system is that they cannot be privately procured. They're collective interests. Keeping people from taking extra risks where the cost is social and the gain is private is a problem of collective agency. How do you discipline individual capitalists? Right? That's the problem. In the golden ages, I forgot who mentioned that, we had a system of regulation. So it was much easier to well, it's gone now. Those club goods in the 50s and the 60s had real meaning. Since the 80s, we've been getting rid of these club goods. And as a result, we've created a situation, and to the economist that I am, the runaway train is our enhanced inability to deal rationally with our collective costs, whether it's the financial system, whether it's the environment, whether it's the human landscape, just name it. Okay? So I submit that's the common theme. Okay, I'll stop at that.